everyone, my name is Zach Finn and I'm the Education Outreach Coordinator here at the Seward House Museum. Originally, this Garden Gate tour was supposed to happen last Saturday, but due to the COVID-19 outbreak, we decided to bring it to you as a virtual tour instead. So today, some of the themes that we're going to be talking about are what the grounds and gardens meant to the Seward family, how each generation of family had a different understanding of the natural world, and how it influenced the 4 acres of property that they owned here, and then look at some of the physical changes made to the architecture to the house, to the grounds themselves. And those are really the 3 major themes we'll be tracing. A little bit of background information before we begin looking at some of these changes. First of all, the Seward House Museum originally sat on 4 acres of property purchased on July 25th, 1816 by Judge Elijah Miller, the original owner of this house. Following Judge Elijah Miller's purchase of the house would change architecturally pretty much with every generation of family that inherited it. Next, his daughter Frances and his son-in-law William Henry Seward, who would serve as Secretary of State, would inherit the property before eventually leaving it to their son Will Jr. and ultimately Will III. Now, when this house and this land was originally purchased by Elijah Miller, Auburn was largely regarded as the frontier. Auburn had only been established and chartered as a village since 1815, and although it existed in a pre-existing populated area, many people, as they were pushing westward thanks to the military track system following the American Revolution, viewed this area as the outskirts of westward expansion. So when Judge Elijah Miller purchases this property in 1816, it appears as if he's the first one to begin building a house, that there wasn't a pre-existing structure here, that the original house built by Elijah Miller was the first one. Now, as Auburn is beginning to expand during this time, Judge Elijah Miller purposefully purchases a plot of property that sits on the outskirts of the Auburn community as he begins setting up what he considers a country abode. Now we're going to be looking at some of those changes that are made to the house, so if you'll follow me. So behind me you can see one of the original kitchen gardens that the Seward family would have kept. And these kitchen gardens were extremely important in pre-supermarket America, even for a family as well established and well connected as the Sewards. Now, these kitchen gardens were used to produce a variety of produce. To quote Frances when she was reporting her thoughts on these gardens, "Our garden furnishes an abundance of fruit and vegetables, but is not kept remarkably neat. Our gardener is rather behind poor in that respect." Frances wasn't a big fan of the gardener at this time. "Still, I should be sorry that you had lost all the fine strawberries. Could you eat them? We have an abundance of raspberries and cherries yet, and the grapes are promising." But it was more than just fruits and vegetables that was produced at the Seward family, by the Seward family kitchen garden behind us here. Depending on when you visited, this property would also feature a menagerie of animals, ranging from cows, horses, chickens, ducks. For many visitors, this country estate would have appeared more to be a working farm than a traditional house belonging to an American politician during the 19th century. Now, for William Henry Seward, who ends up moving to Auburn in 1824, the laborers associated with farm work would have been quite familiar with him. Seward came from a farming family. His father, Samuel Swayze Seward, was not only a politician and a doctor, but an extremely successful farmer in Florida, New York. So Seward was very familiar with the rigors of farming when he moved out to Auburn. Still, gardening and upkeep of the land was more than just a necessary pursuit to make sure that food was supplied. For Seward and Frances, the grounds became a creative outlet where they were able to make some changes to this homestead that they were moving into. For anyone who has gone on one of the house tours, one of the very first stories that we tell when we make our introductions to the family is the fact that when Seward makes his proposal to Elijah Miller, hoping to marry Frances, the only way Elijah Miller will agree to the marriage proposal is that he move into the Auburn residence with him. So in 1824, after Seward marries Frances, he moves to Auburn, moves into the house behind us, and from there, he is in a very strange situation, not only living with his father-in-law, but also living with his boss at the time. So Seward and Frances constantly wanted to make architectural changes to the original 10-room Federalist house that they moved into. Elijah Miller doesn't want to make those changes. So the creative outlet that they turn to is the surrounding grounds and gardens. Oftentimes, when Seward was away during his political career, Frances would write him letters informing him what was happening in the grounds, in the gardens, such as the letter that we just read, where she writes to him telling him what was coming into bloom during this time. And another fixture that visitors to the Seward House Museum can make sure to appreciate when they visit the gardens is the gazebo beside me. Although the current gazebo was built in the 20th century, starting in the mid-19th century, there was historically always a gazebo that existed in this spot. Seward and his family would spend much of their time here surveying the grounds and the gardens, which were much more lush than they are today. And we'll talk about that a little bit later in the talk. But for visitors today who visit the gazebo, the furniture contained within comes historically from the Seward family. Originally, those were created in the 1850s by the James Beebe Company of New York, and they would find themselves sitting out here on the grounds while the Seward family was admiring the property and the grounds that they kept. And right now I'm standing between the barn and carriage house. However, for visitors arriving before 1860 to visit the Sewards, this area would look significantly different than it does today. Originally, the barn and carriage house were originally constructed from wood and were used to contain some of those animals that I mentioned before, primarily horses and cows. However, in April 1860, the Seward family would be victims of an arsonist attack. For anyone who has taken a tour of the Seward House, who has read about the Sewards or followed these virtual lectures, I'm sure you're familiar with the fact that Seward was oftentimes a rather controversial political figure. From his support of Irish immigration to his radical stances against the institution of slavery, Seward made a lot of enemies throughout his political career, even in his adopted hometown, Auburn. And in April 1860, Seward was away preparing to run for the Republican presidential nomination. Seward's son, Will Jr., was left alone taking care of the house. And late one night in April, he recounts hearing a fire alarm, someone yelling outside that a fire had struck the Auburn community. Rushing to the window, Will Jr. looks outside to find that the barn and the carriage house were completely aflame. He rushes outside, hoping to save the livestock that was contained within. And although Will Jr. is able to rescue the cows, 2 horses end up perishing in the blaze. Now, as Will Jr. writes a letter accounting what happens to his father, he points out that all of the doors were locked, that no candles or open flames were lit anywhere near, and that he suspects arson. Now, following the original structure being burned down, Seward would bring in his second oldest son, Frederick, who would go on to serve as Assistant Secretary of State, and was himself an amateur architect to plan out the blueprints for these 2 buildings surrounding us now. While Frederick Seward worked on the blueprints to design the carriage house, the barn and carriage house, the family ended up burying the 2 horses that had perished in the blaze in the pet cemetery, which is actually located right next to us here. And if you'll follow me, I can show you where that spot is. And right behind what used to be the ice house, you'll see a giant black elm tree, and right beneath it is going to be the Seward family pet cemetery. Now, the Seward family had a number of pets, and for anyone interested in learning more about the subject, Emily, our Director of Exhibitions and Collections, recently did a video talk introducing some of our viewers to the pets, so definitely make sure to check that out on our Facebook video stream. But for many of these pets, which range from dogs, including Neppy the Newfoundland, Bella the Terrier mix, or Watchy the Watchdog, the 2 horses that perished in the fire, several cats and animals that were called to place their home. After they passed, the Seward family would use the plot directly behind the black elm tree as a cemetery to their beloved animals. As I mentioned at the start of the tour, if you were to visit in the 19th century, but William and Frances called this place their home, the gardens and the grounds would look significantly different than they do today. Certainly not as well kept as they are. When the Seward family occupied the space, they were appealing to the traditional Victorian understanding of gardening, which means that these grounds and these gardens would have been significantly more lush and overgrown than we're familiar with today. And it seems strange. Oftentimes in modernity, when we're thinking about gardening, we expect neat and orderly beds. That's kind of what we expect to see. But in the 19th century, both William and Frances are looking to use these grounds to connect to the wilderness. So for visitors during the 19th century, one in particular in 1853 kind of accounts how it might look different than it does today. This visitor states, "The foliage of ancient trees shades our windows and allures us to step down into the garden, whose fragrance fills the room. Well-kept arbors line the walls, the air is perfumed by flowers, around which cluster rich garlands of tulips and lovely cupid arrows." This area and this space would have been significantly more overgrown with trees and with foliage than it is today. Another significant change if you were to visit during this time is rather than this lovely bare space here, historically this is where a garden maze would have existed. And the garden maze at its earliest is referenced in 1860, but we start to see a little bit more significant documentation in 1861. Now, around this time, when Frederick Seward is working on the blueprints of the barn and carriage house, which stand behind us here, he also begins working on hand-drawing the designs for this garden maze, which includes a wending maze with circular interior angles, numerous dead ends, and a circuitous route to a center. As Frances is, during the 1860s, oftentimes taking care of this landscape and these grounds by herself or with a gardener that she hires, as William Seward is oftentimes in Washington, D.C. due to the outbreak of the Civil War. Frances is constantly telling Seward what the grounds are like. One of the letters that she writes to him states, "The scarlet runners which I planted in the labyrinth are growing almost as rapidly as Jack's beanstalks. The sticks have a tendency to complicate the walks so much that the labyrinth already affords much amusement." So not only are they adding this garden maze to their landscape, but they're building the garden around it to include the maze as part of the structure. Now, along with the garden maze that would have occupied the space here, another of the additions that would have been in the same area during this time is Seward's attempt at an aviary. William Henry Seward, during the 1860s and upon retirement, was planning to build an aviary. He was never able to procure the funding needed for this very extravagant addition to the landscape. Still, throughout his time spent on this estate, Seward would constantly take time to enjoy not only the natural birds that were flying around the trees here, but he would also import domestic birds as well, including a hummingbird and a canary, which he would keep in cages, and during the winter months they would spend their time in either the library or the hallway. But when it was nice out, like today, Seward would oftentimes bring both the canary and the hummingbird to spend times in the garden, hanging them from various tree branches so they could enjoy the outdoors as well. These grounds would not only have been occupied by the animals that the Seward family brought in. As Frederick Seward is looking back on his father's life, talking about some of the things that William Seward enjoyed when he was away from politics, spending time in here in Auburn, Frederick Seward notes, "The grounds about the house, in fact, were always more or less a city of refuge for unfortunate animals. Stray dogs or cats, finding food and shelter, were much inclined to take up their permanent abode here. Similarly, the city grew up around the grove, but the birds never forsook their accustomed haunt. Swallows twittered in the chimneys, and blackbirds chattered in the treetops. It was one of Father's especial pleasures to sit on the terrace at sunset and watch and listen to the birds returning to their nests." Here we are at Seward Summer House. Well, not the original Seward House that Seward would be familiar with. That original one burned down in 1988. This is a very close recreation to where Seward would often retreat to try to make sense of the political landscape that he was forced to deal with. Now, during his career as a New York State Senator, a New York State Governor, a United States Senator, and ultimately Secretary of State, Seward would oftentimes retreat to the Summer House to work on his speeches and to focus his understanding of this turbulent 19th century political landscape. It's here in Seward Summer House where he would draft some of his most memorable speeches. One such example is the irrepressible conflict speech. Seward would retreat to the Summer House to draft a speech which would be delivered in Rochester in 1858. And in this speech, Seward argued that the institution of slavery and freedom could never coexist singularly in a nation, that the institution of slavery was abhorrent to what the United States stood for, and that ultimately the country would have to pick one economic system over the other, and he certainly preferred the institution of freedom. Now, as Seward was drafting the speech, he was preparing himself to become the second Republican nominee to run for president. The first, John Fremont, had lost to Buchanan in 1856, although during this time Seward was beginning to eye the presidency. So starting in 1858, Seward began establishing himself as a potential candidate to run for the presidency. Now, this speech, The Irrepressible Conflict, is very impressive looking back on it, but during this time it branded him as an agitator. And with John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry in October of 1859, with the subsequent burning of the barn and carriage 6 months later in 1860, Seward's political popularity was beginning to wane, and for the Republican Party, they viewed him as potentially being a little bit too risky a candidate to support. So as Seward was preparing to find out that he was the second Republican candidate to run for the presidency, Seward gathered all of his friends, family, and much of the community here on the grounds here in Auburn. The Republican primary was being held in Chicago, Illinois in May of 1860. Although the first two ballots had heavily favored Seward, as the third ballot was cast, it ended up going to a political upset being given to Abraham Lincoln. Now, Seward finds out about this upset here at the Summer House, surrounded by his friends, surrounded by his family members. Dr. Diamond, the family physician and a close friend, ends up running down South Street, making his way to the Summer House where Seward is gathered to inform him all is lost. Lincoln is chosen on the third ballot. So while the Summer House was oftentimes a place of retreat for Seward to find out, or to plan out his political lectures, it also became the place where he found out about one of the biggest political upsets, and certainly ended his presidential ambitions for the future. Now, when Seward found out that Lincoln was selected as the Republican candidate, he stood up, bears the news quite stoically, and says that Lincoln will be elected president, and that he supposes he has some of the qualities that will make for a good president. Now, as Auburn disperses, and we'll talk about kind of the feelings of the community once we make our way to the front of the house, Seward still bears this news stoically, and turns around and supports President Lincoln, rallying the Republican Party behind this relatively unknown political figure at this time, going on a campaign for Lincoln throughout New York, New England, and the Midwest. And upon his appointment to the presidency, Abraham Lincoln would appoint Seward as Secretary of State to serve in a very senior position in his administration. One more note about the Summer House. So Seward often refers to this as his retreat, some place where he could get away from the hustle and bustle of Washington, D.C., or Albany, or even Auburn, New York. So when he would visit his house here, he would make his way back to the Summer House. And although right now it's pretty clear that you can see from the house to the Summer House, this isn't always the case. In fact, one visitor shortly after Seward's passing writes, "At one end of the Seward yard, probably 150 feet from the porch, is a little summer house. It has never been disturbed and rests now as it did when Seward sat here and wrote so many of his most important state papers. The Secretary of State loved that little summer house, shut off from the street and almost buried in greenery. It afforded a quiet retreat, and there was his wont to go and study out the great problems which confronted the government." So when Seward was alive, the summer house back there would have been essentially shut off from the rest of the world. He would have very much felt like he was alone, able to work on these important state papers and speeches that would go on to define his political legacy. Excellent. Here we see a sundial that was added to the property in the 20th century. Although starting in the 1860s, the Seward family would have had a sundial as well. Theirs would have existed a little bit closer to South Street, towards that central garden that you can see to the right. Two other additions added to the Seward to the property can be seen. The two urns to my left. The one furthest to the right, sitting in the central garden bed, has existed there since 1869. Both of these urns come from Seward's Lafayette Mansion, which he occupied during his Secretary of State years, staying right across the square from Washington, D.C. The urn closest to us was eventually moved. Similar to the sundial, historically that would have existed a little bit closer to South Street. And while Seward was staying at Lafayette Square, and when he moved back to Auburn and set these up, both of these would have been filled with either shrubbery or other plants that the family was looking to highlight. Here we see the Seward family water fountain. Although the fountain will look significantly different depending on which generation of family was calling this place home. Once plumbing was added to the house in 1880, the water fixtures that you can now kind of admire will be added. But originally a slightly smaller fountain would have occupied the space while Seward was here. Seward decorated it with what was called the Scholar Stone, a series of rocks toppled on top of each other. It was quite popular during that time. Following his passing, once Will Jr. inherited this house, he would go on to add the Caught in the Rain fixture, which you can now admire today. Now, this was an extremely popular design for Americans. An early version of the model is believed to have premiered at the Centennial Exhibition of Philadelphia in 1876, and it goes on to become one of the best-selling fountains of that time. Now, starting in 1999, this fountain would be restored, and over 7 layers of paint would actually be stripped from it to reveal what it looks like today, and would have looked like historically similarly. And behind me you can see the southern porch, which is part of an addition made to the house, starting in 1866 and not completed until 2 years later in 1868. Now by this point, Judge Elijah Miller had passed away for some time, and Seward was looking to expand on the traditional federal style of the house. And looking at the side silhouette and profile, you can certainly kind of see Seward's architectural vision. Very popular during the time is what's called the Italianate villa style. So several tiered sizes and heights to the house, kind of looking like a typical villa would look like in the Italian countryside. Now, while the addition will be made in 1866, plans for this renovation had started much earlier. And in 1862, Frances writes a letter to her son Frederick, who is away in Washington, D.C., with Seward serving as Assistant Secretary of State, stating some hesitations about wanting to make this addition. Frances notes, "I am not well today, so I have occupied myself with the addition of the house of which you are making a plan. I object to your present plan. Doubling the front of the house will destroy its identity and make it a city residence, while I prefer the rural character. It would require the sacrifice of the old cherry tree planted by Grandpa, again Judge Elijah Miller, and the home of robins for nearly 40 years. Also a fine locust and the drooping horse chestnut. These are the objections, but there are others of minor importance. However, all of this I leave to your judgment." So one of Frances's concerns about this addition to the house is that it would remove a tree that had been planted by Judge Elijah Miller, her father, home to robins and other trees. So she was very concerned about how the architectural styling might lead the house to look more like a city dwelling. And it is important to note that although both Seward and Frances considered this their city dwelling, Auburn was rapidly expanding around this house and these 4 acres of property during this time. They were no longer on the outskirts or the outlier of the community. they were very much in the central part of Auburn. But because of the very dense trees that they brought in, this very much to them was a secluded area outside of everything else that was going on. Even as South Street, while not as busy as it is today, was bustling during this time. Now, some of those trees I mentioned grew here naturally, but other ones Seward had to go to a local forest to bring back. Oftentimes, him and Gus Seward, their oldest son, would bring the two of them and two family servants would make their way to the local forest and bring back a series of trees to plant around these areas. Seward would oftentimes write about this in the letters as him and Francis were constantly away from each other traveling, but it was to continue that connection to nature. So following Francis's passing in 1865, the addition to the house will be completed in 1868, but Seward is still looking to maintain that connection to nature. So one of the architectural features that he includes is the pocket doors, which you can see to the side of the globes there. Now these pocket doors would often be times left open, allowing the interior of the house to flow to the exterior of the house, so visitors and family alike can make their way to the inside, to the outside world where they could appreciate that nature that they so enjoy. And if you were to take a house tour of the museum, this is basically where your tour would start, walking through the front doors as you made your way to explore the house. But for this garden tour, this is where we're going to wrap up our talk today. So right now we are standing in front of the Seward House Museum. The front entrance is facing South Street. And historically, when this house was first constructed, it would have looked significantly different than it does now. We talked a little bit about the southern porch addition that basically doubles the size of the house. Now, originally, if you were to visit in 1816, anything to the right of the doorway here would have been in existence. That's part of the original structure built by Judge Elijah Miller in that traditional federal style. But to the left of the doorway, that's all part of the 1866 to 1868 construction. When Francis was talking about doubling the size of the front of the house, that's what she meant. They were basically expanding beyond the doorway, turning an asymmetrical front into a symmetrical looking front of the house. Now, as you saw while you were making your way up the walkway here, included in front of the house is a limestone carriage step, which for visitors making their way down South Street on a carriage, they would have used to disembark from their carriage. And the terracotta lions, which Judge Elijah Miller has added to the house in 1824, the same year that William Seward would marry his daughter Frances. Now behind me, you can see Seward's addition, kind of comparable to those terracotta lions, in the griffins that will eventually be added to the house during Seward's time as Secretary of State. But the terracotta lions have a special place in history. Back at the summer house, we talked about Seward's stunning upset to Abraham Lincoln for the Republican nomination. Now, not only were Seward's friends and family gathered back at the Southern House with him, but the rest of the Auburn community had descended on this property looking to celebrate. Now, when news of Lincoln's appointment, or rather election as the representative for the Republican Party finds its way through the crowd, a reporter writes, "The governor's grounds were thronged by his friends, eager for the dispatch which should announce his nomination, which was never to come. Along the wires flashed the results. Lincoln was nominated. The messenger arrived at the governor's gate, so pale, trembling and speechless with agony, that even the lions, those terracotta lions at the front of the house, were moved to tears." So certainly a somber scene here in Auburn when Seward finds out about that upset loss to Abraham Lincoln. Still, the two would develop a great relationship and were able to navigate the turbulent years of the American Civil War together. And this is going to conclude our garden tour of the Seward House Museum. But before I go, I do want to kind of wrap everything up in Seward's own words, which obviously he does much better than I could ever hope to. And while Seward is traveling the world, he's preparing to return to Auburn after retiring from public office. He goes on two whirlwind tours, initially visiting Alaska and Mexico, and then circumnavigating the globe. And as he plans to return, he writes to William Jr., who is beginning to move into the house and set his family up. And Seward writes, "I dread to have our new spacious, free and simple country dwelling furnished like the parlors of merchants and bankers in our great and ostentatious cities. Just as my life and ways differ from theirs, so ought my dwelling. To my eye, the garden, the fountain, and the birds that stretch far out from the terrace entirely away from the house are richer and nobler ornaments."